Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next in this series. Two important things to say. First of all, this share is should be the Nishmas, my uncle, my great uncle Philly, Refoel ben Mordechai Yehuda, and it should be an neshama for him. Secondly, we are nearing the end of this mini series. Probably one more slot on this. We'll see. So I am open for nominations for our next great thinker. That we'll look at, and if no nominations come through, I have my own ideas, but I'm happy to hear suggestions. We looked extensively last week at Rav Kook's views around morality, and we will continue to look at them this week. In particular, we saw a number of things that he said. His stress on natural morality, his fear that a mistaken sense of Yerushalayim and Dikduk Halacha would lead to a loss of natural morality, and his belief that Torah is there to enhance morality, natural morality, rather than, but if the fear of heaven leads to actions which are less beneficial to the spiritual and moral status of the individual and society, then there's something missing. And out of that emerged his critique of the Mulumodim, those who are sort of overly intellectual, overly learned, and lose the natural sense of morality. They use learning and intellectual reasoning to distort morality. Which fed into a little bit about I think the noble savage sort of ideology that he expressed, and this is part of his very holistic worldview in which he sees the divine, the light of the divine energy emanating from everywhere and everything. And in this sense, it's linked to his positive view of the pioneering youth who are settling the land, and through so doing, rooting themselves. And he's wary of cosmopolitanism, of this rupturing of a grounded relationship with reality, and sort of urban life which cuts one off from nature and from a natural sense of existence. And in that sense, this all feeds into his very holistic view. He's a unifier because he lives in a world so suffused with the divine, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who is one. He sees a unity in everything, and his ability to see the good within that which others saw bad, the good within some very radically secularist and atheistic leaders of the revival of the national Jewish movement, is because he sees everything as ultimately a manifestation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's where his unity comes from, though he is conscious that this has to be bounded by halacha, because otherwise you can break down all barriers between good and evil. We saw also that he sees this as at the root of the national longing for the return to Israel. He says, if this is just about safe haven and fighting anti-Semitism and security, then this is just pragmatic. This isn't an idealistic movement. This is just there's nothing wrong with safety and being safe. That's a fine aim in life, but that's not a noble ideal. And the real heart of why Zionism is capturing our imagination is because it is a national expression of Jewish identity, of Jewish values. And what's at the heart of national Jewish identity? Kindness, chesed, morality. The Jews became a nation in Sefer Bereshis, in the world of the Ovis, pre-Matan Torah, and Sefer Bereshis is a book of kindness and morality that the Ovis are expressing. On top of that is layered Matan Torah, which is a channeling of that and a direction to that. But as we return back to being a nation, that's the yearning within our souls that we're experiencing. We're feeling frustrated that we can't express our national identity. He says the secret of the nation's longing for redemption is not our terrible suffering. It's not the sounds of a despised nation seeking for itself a safe haven. That would be that's lacking something. There's no doubt that what's really motivating us is something lofty and elevated, an everlasting vision, embracing ultimately the whole of mankind. And What I'm trying in this part of the series is trying to show how all Rav Kook's ideas are linked in a complicated web. So Rav Kook's uh, Achdus, his sense of a unified divine embracing the world, his mysticism that everything reflects that divine, his embrace of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, his belief that this can emerge um, from even those who ostensibly are far from religion. And in a moment, we'll see his solution to the problems of the dangers of nationalism all are interconnected in this way that we're describing. Because Rav Kook is conscious that nationalism, in unleashing nationalism, one is unleashing a dangerous force. And without going too much into current affairs in Israel, we are aware that there are those who small parts, thankfully, of those who claim to be the successors of Rav Kook's ideology, who have taken nationalism in a way that has brought out the dark sides of nationalism and an exclusivity to it and an aspect of might is right and other elements which are very disturbing in where nationalism can go. And Rav Kook is conscious of that danger, and his answer to that problem is our nationalism is founded on what we are at our deepest core as a nation. Our nationalism should be founded on what we are at the core as a nation, which is a world of chesed as per the Ovis, in which we don't just do chesed and kindness and love to ourselves, but we express it universally and belong. And this is again because we are believers in one God. And God, v'rachamov al kol masov, whose mercies extend to all creation, we in echoing and mimicking God, also obviously our mercy and kindness extends to all peoples. So he sees that nationalism driven just by a desire for safe haven is pragmatic, but is no noble goal. Nationalism just driven by a desire to be a national expression of nationhood is dangerous. But if you understand my views of the relationship between halacha and morality, and of how the divine suffuses everything, if you understand what's deep in Nishmas Yisrael, this is a phrase he uses a lot, buried deep within the soul of Israel, even if the practitioners and those who are expressing it don't recognize this, if we understand this, then we understand that this nationalism is not dangerous, but on the contrary, will be elevating for us and ultimately elevating for the whole of mankind. He also addresses a second danger in the revival of Jewish nationalism, and this is its complexity. And I should emphasize, by the way, that Rav Kook does not, very rarely does he sort of again, remember the earlier part of what we were speaking about when we discussed him. He writes a lot of the time as a poet, so he doesn't engage in this section of his writing in formalized halachic reasoning. He's a master halachist, and he has incredibly important halachic works. But here he's not writing in halachic terminology, so he doesn't engage in shaklavataria, in a back and forth. It's not that he quotes his critics or the counter arguments and then responds to them. He's just giving this free flow of consciousness in which he's sharing his vision. But buried in what he's writing is an answer to a lot of the challenges. When we spoke about Zionism, and I gave a series on Zionism a while back, and spoke about different approaches to Zionism and so on, one of the ideas that I think is very important, and I tried to bring out, is that, and this leads to Rav Kook's next point, is he is conscious of the complexities of a revival of Jews as a nation. And let me just try and explain what that means. We are conscious of the idea of a chovas yachid, an individual obligation. A lot of halacha is about us as yichidim, as individuals. There's things we specifically as individuals need to do. We need to say Shema every day. We need to give tzedakah. We need to shake Lolam and Esrog at the right time of year. We need to make sure that we don't steal. We need to engage in honest practice. These are personal obligations. Some of them we may happen to do as a group. You may join part of a tzedakah initiative. You may say Shema in shul when you're davening. But fundamentally, these are chovas yochid, personal obligations. We're also conscious of chovas tzibur, communal obligations. There's things which we as an individual don't need to do, perhaps, but we need to ensure that as a Jewish tzibur, we are offering. So sometimes we have to be part of that tzibur. tefillah b'tzibur, or sometimes no one individual can be held responsible for it, but as a unit, we need to make sure that we provide this. A Jewish community needs to have Jewish schools, it needs to have a mikveh, it needs to have a kupas tzedakah. The Rambam says any Jewish city that doesn't have a soup kitchen is not fit to call itself a Jewish society. So there's tzibur communal obligations. What we've had less practice for the last 2,000 years is realizing there's also national obligations. There's a Torah of national obligations, which really actually probably we could list on maybe 3 fingers the amount of thought that we give to national obligations. Maybe we get to Sefer Devarim and we hear a drosh about Som Tasim Melech or Melech. You need to appoint a legitimate form of Jewish government. Maybe we talk about Parsha Zachor and Mechias HaMolek. It's a little more difficult to understand. So we speak a little bit about national obligations, but very, very, very little. Rav Kook, therefore, is conscious, he says, that we're simply out of practice. We haven't thought long and hard about what it means to be a Jewish nation. It's easy to use the motto, the mantra, we're a Jewish nation. But what actually does that mean? What are the national morals? How what does nationhood demand of moral obligations? Just to give some topical examples of this, I gave a series on the ethics and morals of war. It's clear that war and its ethics have a different structure of how it behaves than personal ethics. But what does that look like is very, very complicated, and a lot of the debate about what's going on revolves around these things. On a personal level, if a policeman takes a decision to shoot a criminal at the risk of a bystander, we may hold that action itself to be criminal. In war, the tragic essence of war is that sometimes there are innocent people who are caught up in it. And I'm not making comments on how and in what way and the details of this, but the principle of this it was one of the ideas that we explored when we looked at this. So national morality is complicated. And then there are practical questions about what does a Jewish national state look like, made up of people who care about halacha, and those who, let's use Rav Kook's formulation, don't realize that they care about halacha, but fundamentally also are driven by very, very spiritual values. What does it mean to run a country in which on the weekends people can't get a person who doesn't have a private vehicle simply can't get public transport just to do something innocent, like go to the beach? What does that mean? Is that kfir datit? Is that religious imposition of moral values? Or is this what it means to have a Jewish state? What does it mean to have a Jewish state where there's no nisuin ezrachim, where citizens can't get married to each other if this is a non-halachic marriage? And then what does it mean to have a Jewish state where that isn't the case? So Rav Kook is conscious of these difficulties. He phrases it in one of the newly published works is called Ma'amarei, the Ma'amarim, the essays, the short essays of Rav Kook. He says he thinks there's a V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha on a personal level, after Refoel Kamocha. What does it look like on an international level, on a UN level? Who are the Reacha, the colleagues of a Jewish national identity, of a Jewish nation, a Jewish state? The other states, what does Refoel Kamocha look like on a national level? There's no Shulchan Aruch about this. There's no reference works to which we can easily turn. So, but Rav Kook emphasizes again and again that his nationalism is not meant to be exclusionary, it's meant to be inclusive. Let's just quickly tie that back into the mystical thought of Rav Kook. In the thought of the mystics, evil can't exist. Pure evil can't exist as an independent force. If everything is derived from godliness, then what would be the place of something which is 100% evil? How can it exist? It would be a zero contradiction to God. From what would it be yonic? From what would it draw its energy and its existence? It must be that all evil has at its heart a nugget of goodness. The Kabbalah call this nitzotzos, a spark of the divine. Where is that spark of the divine? There must be some good potential within it, something that can bring it back. We call this teshuvah, right? The idea that something can be returned back to its divine origin. If it was completely ruptured and broken, it can't exist. We say these ideas, we often don't realize what we're saying. One will hear around Pesach countless divrei Torah around Shah Hanun, the mystical idea. The fifth impurity, the Jews didn't fall to the 50th gate. You can't fall to that level. If you're permanently ruptured, by definition, there has to be a cessation of existence. And Rav Kook quotes Mamori Chazal around this. We're coming up to Purim. So the Gemara in Megillah, B'nei Bonim shall Haman lomdu Torah b'Bnei Brak, that even Haman, who represents Amalek, his grandchildren. So there's a powerful message in that. B'nei Bonim shall Haman, the grandchildren of Haman, learn Torah in B'nei Brak. B'nei Bonim shall Sisra, learn Torah. The Gemara says, the Talmud Yerushalmi says, So everything can be brought back, and he says, yes, you can find scattered quotes of Chazal that can be abused and misused otherwise, but to be true to Jewish nationalism, this has to include this can only be as an expression of the value of the Avos, which was our founding national charter, which is built around chesed and morality and kindness. So this is one idea that Rav Kook expresses. Moving on the subject of morality, he addresses the dearth of moral guidance in the Torah. This is a very, very interesting problem or issue that needs to be looked at. When you learn through the halachas of the Torah in detail, you discover that there is a relative paucity of overtly moral halachas, where halacha deals directly with morality. So you go through Parshas Mishpatim, clearly there's a morality that underlies the legalistic content of Mishpatim, but there's not that much in which it explicitly says direct moral values. You learn halachas, there's a wealth of information, but again, not that much directly around morality. The Torah says, "V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha," and included in that clearly is a lot. The Torah says, "V'asisa hayashar v'hatov," you should do that which is straight and good, and clearly included in that is a lot. But there's not that many psukim that directly commits around this, even things that are fundamental to Yiddishkeit, like hachnosas orchim. Where's the pasuk that says "Tachnisa orchim l'vatechem"? You know, bring in guests to your home. Bikur cholim. Where are the psukim that speak about that? Kavuras hameis. These are all, the Rambam subsumes them in V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, and clearly they are. But where is the detailed guidance to these things? Now, actually, where do we learn these things from? So some of them we learn from stories, from Sefer Bereshis, which brings us back to Rav Kook's other idea that there's a more underlying framework. Some of them we learn from general statements, which Chazal then fleshed out and amplified and expanded into more of a coherent halachic structure. The Ramban, in a famous mini essay that he writes, speaks about the pasuk of Kadoshim Tihiyu, and he says that any legal framework can be abused. Humans have infinite ingenuity. You create what you think is a really safe tax code, and as soon as the new budget comes out, the accountants get to work, and they realize how actually, when you look at it in detail, something can just be arranged and done in a different way, and you can get through that. This is no chisoron or limitation in the Torah. He says that this is the Ramban says, this is a reflection of the reality of rules and algorithms and human ingenuity. So no halachic system, says the Ramban, can avoid the challenge of what, in his famous terminology, he labels a menuvel b'reshus haTorah, a thoroughly corrupt and revolting and disgusting individual who keeps every halach in the Torah. You can keep 100%, at least 630 mitzvahs, and be absolutely fine, and be doing everything, ticking every box, and be a horrible, corroded individual. Therefore, the pasuk gives an additional 613th mitzvah of kadoshim to you. Shall be holy. Ask yourself, is this kodesh? Is this holy what I'm doing? The Rambam parallels that to another mitzvah, one I quoted just now, v'asisa hayashar v'hatov. You should do that which is straight and that which is good. And he says this is the parallel in Bein Adam l'Chaveiro. So in Bein Adam l'Mokum, in your religious life, always ask yourself, beyond halacha, is this kodesh? And in your pursuits of financial affairs, interactions with people, Bein Adam l'Chaveiro, your dealings with individuals, ask yourself, is this yashar v'tov? Is this straight and good? Is this yashar v'tov? Don't just ask yourself, is this in line with halacha? You have to do both. Phone up the Rav and ask the Shaila about the particular monetary transaction or the particular kashrus and so on. But then ask yourself another question. This is the view of the Ramban. Rav Kook takes this further, and rather than seeing this as a reluctant accommodation to the reality of how humans operate, he says there's a weakness in all halacha, in which there's a he doesn't use this terminology, so there's a kof aleim hakukugas, there's an enforcement of it. The nature of law, of legalities, is that you have to do it. But if this is about a relationship, it has to come from within ourselves. A morally commanded obligation, is that real expression of morality? If you're given tzedakah because you're obligated to so do, which is no bad thing. It's better than the alternative of not giving tzedakah. But if you're just doing it as an obligation, are you seeing the recipient as an esrog, as an mitzvah, as an object that you're using for the mitzvah, or is there a real relationship? Is there real care about spirituality, about morality? So Rav Kook says that the Torah, the whole Torah, is in a sense a reluctant accommodation to human weakness. He turns the Ramban in a sense on its head, and he says the idea that there needs to be a divinely instructed Torah, which is essential. Again, he's not an antinomian. He's not against halacha chassidom. He's a very, very senior halachist in his own right. But he's emphasizing the limitations of law, of halacha. He said law needs to be put in place because you need boundaries. But the very concept of needing of a Torah in which things are imposed on us is the reluctant accommodation to human weakness. In essence, every mitzvah should be done as a hidur, as a voluntarily chosen beautification of our relationship to Hashem. Because Torah is a Torah of chesed, it's meant to be a Torah of kindness, it's meant to be a Torah of love, it's meant to be a Torah of relationship. And such can't be commanded. Morals are too important to be mitzvahs. They're too integral to the foundation of what it means to be a spiritual person. They can't be commanded and to lose the essence of commandment. Again, connecting the dots to other parts of Rav Kook's view, this brings us back to Sefer Bereshis. Because how did we differ from the others? That they were pre-Matan Torah. They weren't commanded to do what they do. They could serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu because they chose to do so. We need, in the journey of the Torah, in a sense, is a journey of getting back to Sefer Bereshis. If you can take your Parshas Mishpatim and your Parshas Tetzaveh with all its specific details and bring that back to Sefer Bereshis so that the law doesn't destroy any of the relationship, then you've achieved what a person should be. Our mission is to take Har Sinai and integrate that with the Bereshis. Again, Bereshis, which he linked to nationalism, which he saw as a safe of Chesed. If we can combine the two, then that's achieving what a person is meant to do. Again, just to connect the dots, because we've spoken about this before, I gave a series a while back on Sunday morning, which I asked, is Torah ethical? Is it identical? And we discussed a little bit the relationship between law and ethics. We saw the great thinkers' agreements between the Mekubalim and the philosophers, between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, that there can be a dilemma and a dichotomy between spirituality and halacha and how they deal with it. Reb Chaim Volozhin, when he attacks Hasidus, who he sees, correctly or not, but he fears that Hasidus is saying, sometimes do an Aveira Lishma, sometimes you can justify doing something forbidden in halacha because you're convinced this is the fulfillment of your spiritual goals. He does not respond by saying, Chas v'shalom, there can't be such a thing. He responds by saying they can, but nonetheless, that's what law means. That's what halacha means. You have no choice. So that the essence of halacha is you have to do it. It's a framework, and sometimes the framework means that you can be a menuvel b'reshus HaTorah. You can technically keep the framework and abuse spirituality, and sometimes the framework can mean that you have to make sacrifices because that's what law means. But Sefer Bereshis didn't demand that of us. The Ramban speaks about this when he speaks about how the of us could marry two sisters and various other examples of this. He says they were pre-Matan Torah. That was the luxury of being pre-Matan Torah. Post-Matan Torah, we live in a different relationship to God. Rav Kook's not chas v'shalom arguing with, and the Rambam writes similar in his Moed Nevuchim. So all the streams of Judaism reflect this idea that Rav Kook is not arguing with this concept. Of course, he recognizes the seniority, the supremacy of halacha. However, he says don't lose sight of the voluntary. Don't lose sight of Sefer Bereshis. Don't lose sight of the national. Don't lose sight of the world of us. Don't lose sight of the inner morality, and to try and make your relationship to halacha and to mitzvahs be as much about ahava and chesed and as little about authoritarianism and rule. I want to just share a quick story around this, and then I'll take the question. I was very privileged to be Menachem Oval to Reb Aryeh Levine's. When he was sitting, Rabbi Levine's youngest son, I still had the privilege of meeting when he was sitting Shiva, and his name was Simcha Sholem. and Simcha Shlomo, I'm sorry, Simcha Shlomo Levin. And I'm not going to go into Rabbi Levin now. He's another fascinating person who was a Talmud of Rav Kook and also of the Old Yeshiv, another one of these combination figures. And he told me this story of his name. So he have I shared this story before? I don't know. So he was born very shortly after the death of two very, very great figures. First was Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk, the Meshech Chochmah, and the second was Reb Shlomo Eliashiv, the grandfather of the figure who we know as Rav Eliashiv, who was the Leshem, who was the senior Kabbalist of his generation. So we're going back to the early 1900s, and certainly in the Ashkenazi world, he was considered the senior Kabbalist, exceptionally influential Makubal, who's molded in a very, very significant way the learning of Kabbala into modernity, into 2024 and onwards. Very, very senior figure, and they both died. And Reb Aryeh Levin's son was born shortly afterwards, and he decided to name his son after these two great figures. Rav Kook was honored with Amida Lebrachas. Sorry, Rav Kook was honored with saying the brachas. So at a bris, often the Rav is honored with saying the brachas post bris, which include the naming of the child. By the way, if I ever did this, I would be sacked. But listen to this story. Reb Aryeh Levin steps forward and he says to Rav Kook, Rav Kook pauses, and then the father gives the name that they wish to give the child, and he says to Rav Kook, Shlomo Simcha. So Rav Kook hears the name and names the child Simcha Shlomo. He reverses the order. So he's ignored the father's instructions as to how to name the son. So afterwards, Rabbi Aryeh Levin asked the father why he did so. He said, "You're naming Simcha. I guess you were naming Simcha after Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk, the Meshech Chochmah, and Shlomo after the Leshem, this Makubal, this Kabbalist." And he said, "Yes." He said, "Halacha always has to come ahead of Kabbala." So I put Simcha ahead of Shlomo, not the other way around. So when you name after, so Rav Kook is aware of the dangers of a fascinating story, aware of the dangers of antinomianism. This is the story. No, he obviously knew about Levin, and knew about Levin was like a son to him, and that their relationship was such that he was convinced that Rav Levin would accept this ruling. But anyway, this was a story I had at the risk, and I'll just share it with you because as I was saying this, it felt I was reminded of the story. And Rav Kook is conscious, obviously, that halacha comes ahead of mysticism, but nonetheless, he says the Torah is finding a fine balance in order to ensure that it doesn't ruin union with the divine, love, and the mystical experience by over emphasis, by taking halacha into realms in which it doesn't need directly to go. Sorry, yes. Yes. Okay, very interesting question. Just so Zonan has asked, is there a shared approach between Rav Kook and the Rambam on this? There are similarities between Rav Kook and the Rambam in their thinking, in many ways. And maybe at the end, when I try and summarize Rav Kook, I'll revisit this. But Rav Kook's belief and embrace of modernity and culture and science as necessary for as carrying within them truths that we need to know. Maybe this week or maybe next week we'll get to some almost scary statements of Rav Kook around this. And his nuance of understanding of the relationship between truth as directly contained in the Torah and a sort of universal truth that underpins things. In that sense, there are comparisons between him and the Rambam. However, ostensibly, the Rambam is a very different thinker to Rav Kook because the Rambam is no mystic. And this model of a divinely suffused world in which the unity means out of everything emerges a sort of divine spark is not at all the Rambam's formulation. I gave a series several years back around between the Rambam and Ramchal and so on, in which I argued that the gap is not as wide as is often presented, but there is a gap there nonetheless. The Rambam, it does not engage in the poetic style of Rav Kook. His reasoning is very, very tight and very formulated and very, very carefully crafted. Maybe this week or next week we'll look at dialectic in Rav Kook. But basically, Rav Kook sees the world as full of tensions and synthesis needing to be found. The Rambam doesn't have that sort of complication in him. Rav Kook feels a tension between the rational and the poetic, or the rational and the mystic, but we're not really aware of a massive amount of that in the Rambam. I have an essay published it's in the library now. It kind of was in the library, in which I deal with I argue that the Rambam in foundation also touches on in a sense a mystical belief, but ostensibly there's quite a gulf between the two. In even though they come to similar conclusions in some ways, they're coming from a very different framework. The Rav Kook is very significantly influenced by Kabbala. He's a Kabbalist ultimately. Just a few lines maybe. This comes from Igeres Raya from one of his letters. He said, you can't listen to this. He said, you can't measure the magnitude of the loss that human culture would suffer if these exalted values were set out as obligations. In other words, were the Torah to have made halacha out of every moral scenario, you can't imagine how enormous the loss would be, because we would lose our ability to connect to morality. I'll pause there because just been a bit of myself free flow of consciousness. Any thoughts or questions around this? Just before we... Yeah.
Just reminding myself that a couple of years ago, after a similar lecture about the relation between halacha and morality, I sent you an article which I had quoted in my Oxford Law exam.
Yes.
From the Harvard Law Review in 1961 by Mr. Justice Silver, who wrote an article about the law and moral.
Yes. Yes.
And he was arguing, I think I'm familiar with the argument, that in a sense Judaism was unique in how it synthesizes law and morality for various historical reasons, etc.
Yes.
But if anyone's interested in the article,
yes. Thank you. Okay, so yes, I remember you sending me the article, and in this series, I'm in a way trying just to present Rav Kook's thinking. You can make, in some ways, the counter argument, and I personally think both are true, and I don't think there's a contradiction between the two claims. I don't think I've ever discussed in this forum ethical monotheism, what we mean by ethical monotheism. I touched on it once when I spoke about that. No, I've never touched on it Sunday morning. On Wednesday night once, I looked at the Torah's loathing of Avodah Zarah, and why the Torah loathes paganism. It's quite an interesting question, perhaps even a weird question to ask. Why does the Torah loathe paganism so much, right? But so this ties into this. There is a synthesis between ethics and morality, 100%. Kedoshim to you, which I mentioned, is perhaps the primary cetera of this, in which in one pasuk, again and again throughout the parsha, the Torah will weave an ethical injunction and it'll weave kashrus in the same pasuk as so there clearly is an a huge amount of ethics in the Torah, and clearly much of that is legislated for. Nonetheless, if you do a count, it's significantly, but far and away, a smaller section of the Torah, and there's a dearth of really basic moral, and even certainly there's no moral principles in the Torah, sweeping moral principles in the Torah. The famous golden mean of the Rambam, right? It doesn't just come to the Rambam, but from other things also, but the middle path and so on is the Rambam links to Valachta B'drachav. You should walk in the ways of God. So God is the role model, Mahu Chanun, Afatay Chanun, just like he's merciful and so on. But just like he's gracious, you should be gracious. Just like he's merciful, you should be merciful. But very little of this is spelled out. But it's true that between V'halachta B'drachav, walking the ways of God, and V'ahavta L'recha K'mocha, you get the whole section of Torah of Bein Adon Achleru, and that's more or less how the Rambam introduces these chapters in which he deals with Achnosas Orchim and Bikkur Cholim and other things.
Same sort of distilling all these moral principles together. Maybe that's a gap.
So there have been svarim written about this. By the way, just to contextualize this, right? Rav Kook is a contemporary of the Chofetz Chaim, who wrote, besides his Mishnah Berurah, wrote one of the most incredible works of modernity, but accused by his critics in a way of being counter to Rav Kook's very point. And this is the famous Shmir Saloshan and Chofetz Chaim of the Chofetz Chaim. He got his name from that, right? He didn't get his name from his Mishnah Berurah, which is the classic halachic work on Orach Chaim, on day-to-day life. But he wrote another work on the laws of Lashon Hara. Now, where was Jewish authorship for 2,000 years before that. He took a selection of Mamori Chazal, which were offering ethical guidance about Shemiras Halashon, about how we speak and avoiding negativity and bad mouthing. Stuck him in the Torah, Seinach Rochel, 100%. And a short section of the Rambam, who was, you asked about similarity between Rav Kook and Rambam. The Rambam was the great codifier who did codify some of these moral rules. And with the mastery of sources and the genius of the Chafetz Chaim, he created a mini Shulchan Aruch out of the laws of Shemiras Halashon. So he took a something which had never been systemized and algorithmized and formalized and given rules, and he made out of that a set of rules. His critics said, you've taken a set of sort of moral values and tried to make them rules, and that's a degradation of it. His supporter said, but look, he's made a Shulchan Aruch out of it. He's given us clear guidance. And when to this day, if I get asked a question around Lashon Hara, an inquiry around business practice or a review online, or I've got problems with my tenants, can I warn the next landlord about them, or investment, and 1,000 areas, we now open the Shulchan Aruch, the Chafetz Chaim to give a psak. So it's ultimately the Chafetz Chaim in that sense has won the argument. He has become the dominant figure in 150 years of halachic discourse in Klal Yisrael. But I'm not saying Rav Kook would have opposed in the real world the writing of the Chafetz Chaim. I'm not aware of him commenting on that. He may have acknowledged begrudgingly that this was necessary. All Rav Kook is doing is reminding us of the dangers of over legalizing things. Also, that's the point. Sorry, you had your hand up.
Oh, I was just going to point out that the Gemara itself recognizes at times the overriding power of a moral principle.
Yes. So this is a very important point. Again, everything Rav Kook says is founded on Chazal, and he's living in the world of Chazal. And there are indicators of these ideas within Chazal, but not fleshed out in the way that Rav Kook does. We discussed last week Rav Kook's belief in the wisdom of the masses. Gemara Poik Chazi Amadabar, go and see what the people on the street are doing. But he takes it much further. And you're absolutely correct. The Gemara, Savara is often translated in halachic terminology as logic, which is a very poor translation. A better translation is maybe reason, but even reason carries connotations with it. But the Gemara will reference a moral principle and say svarahi. It's a svara. It doesn't mean it's logical. It's reasonable. It's appropriate. It's moral. Sometimes it means Hilchos Brachos. The Gemara spends an omud, a whole page at the beginning of Ketzim Barachim, trying to find psukim as sources for brachos. Basically, the conclusion of the Gemara is that other than Birchas Hamazon, Devarim, chapter 8, V'chalta v'savata or Veirachta, other than benching after eating of bread and maybe Shivas Aminim, according to some opinions, there's no source for brachos. Says the Gemara, Svarahi, it's reasonable. We live in Hashem's world. How could it be appropriate to eat without asking permission and without thanking afterwards? The Gemara uses it in perhaps the most important financial rule of adjudication in financial disputes. Hamotzi mechaveira olav haraya. Right, you can't learn any of dinim ominous, any of monetary law in halacha without coming across the principle. Hamotzi mechaveira olav haraya. If I wish to take something from you, I have to bring a proof. The burden of proof is on the one who wishes to change the setting, to take from someone, not on the recipient. I can't just come up to you and accuse you of having stolen my woolen scarf. I have to bring a raya for it. You're not the one who has the burden of proof. I'm the one who has the burden of proof. And the Gemara's basic conclusion again is that doesn't need a pasuk. It's a svara. It's a piece of reasoning. So the concept of svara, including moral reasoning, is there in the Gemara. Yeah, and then thank you for that addition. Yeah.
It's totally legalistic.
Yes.
But you're then taking away any sort of individual aspect of human being. I mean, if everything's done by law, what role do you have as an individual to? I mean, I'm just thinking about maybe we're talking thinking something like that. If everything is legalistic, then does the individual have a role?
So this is in essence part of Rav Kook's point. That again, I want to emphasize: no one disagrees on some level with what Rav Kook is saying. No one or no one should argue, even those who disagree with Rav Kook, none of them should argue that the sum totality of the vision of how Jews should be is contained in halacha. There's clearly that which is beyond halacha. In a way, that's the view of the Kabbalists when they're talking about Kabbala. That's the view of the philosophers when they talk about philosophy. That's the view of the Bali Musa when they talk about Musa development. That's the view of Hasidus when they so everyone is putting some larger framework. We spoke about this again when I spoke about ethics and Torah. And we discussed why is it that we need to keep Torah at all? Who says we need to keep Torah? Right? So God's commanded them. Why should we listen to God? And I want to summarize what's a very complicated argument too quickly. But the answer is that one of the possible answers is there's an ethical framework that exists beyond it. For example, appreciation. God created the world. We're guests in His world, and therefore we ought to listen. So the idea of an ethical framework within which Torah operates is not controversial. Rav Kook takes us much further, in which he's saying that there's a deliberate choice not to legalize everything, for exactly your point, in order to stop this being relationshipal, in order to stop this being emerging from within myself, because moral and ethical behavior is contradicted by doing it because you're instructed to do so. If it doesn't emerge from within yourself, then you're missing the verachma vel kol masov. It ends up squashing the individual, and it ends up losing a genuine relationship to HaKadosh Baruch and to morality. So it's in this sense, it's just the degree to which Rav Kook is emphasizing this point. Rav Kook, by the way, we were talking about the dangers of this. He emphasizes that this can go too far. There are great thinkers in some respects in Jewish history. One of the constant refrains of attack on what we would call orthodoxy, which is, I'm using this in a historically anachronistic sense, because it doesn't have that term then, is this attack that you've become legalistic hair splitters and you've lost the big picture. In many ways, in the closing era of the second Beis Hamikdash, when there were a number of breakaway sects from what we would now call orthodoxy, from the world from which Chazal emerged, most famously Christianity, because that's the one that survived. Much of the critique was around this point. You've become so legalistic that you've lost the spirit of the law. We know there were other groups that were saying this. One of the oldest puns of which I'm aware emerged from that era, because amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, so the group that settled in Qumran and other areas were perhaps Essenes. Nowadays, we're not so sure it was Essenes, but certain groups somewhat similar to the Essenes were certainly very critical of the establishment in Yerushalayim, and they refer to them in one reference as Dorshei Chalakot, Dorshei Chalokos, which is a pun on Dorshei Halachos. So let me just explain the pun. We refer to what we're doing as being Doresh, a drasha of Chazal. Doresh means to seek out subtlety of movement, and we are Doresh Halachot. We're Doresh Halachos. We seek out Halachos. There's a very different word, Dorshei, seekers of Chalakot. Chalak, Chalak means smooth, slippery tongue, smooth talk, hair splitters. They are Dorshei Chalakot, say the critics in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not Dorshei Halachos. So this is emergent criticism, right? If we look at Shabtai Tzvi's negation of halacha through mysticism, if we look at the emergence of reform in modernity, much of its criticism is around this, that you've lost the inner values and so on. All Rav Kook is saying really is, he's saying that there's a truth in this. If you don't realize that that halacha is meant to be a framework within so much more can be included. Our response to this criticism should not be that the critics are wrong in that halacha can become that. It's simply don't throw out halacha because of that. Infuse your halacha with an awareness of the bigger picture. Don't chuck out halacha because of that. Rav Kook is, and he explicitly says this, so I was going to get this later, he explicitly references Shabtai Tzvi and the founders of Christianity and others in this, and he says, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not chas v'shalom joining the ranks of these individuals who threw out halacha. I'm simply saying that we need to live in a world in which we haven't forgotten the bigger picture and the moral and values that lie behind all of this. Sorry, you had your. Okay, so I think we'll stop here for today. I want next week we'll finish off next week because we can go on endlessly, and I don't want this to carry on too long. Next week, we'll look at universalism and pluralism in Rav Kook's thought. We'll look at dialectic, very important word, dialectic, and I will try and share with you a summary of 4 or 5 essays that Rav Kook wrote. Sorry, next week I'm away on the trip. Sorry, 2 weeks time. Next week, no share, 2 weeks' time. And Emir Hashem, then we'll finish off. I was going to finish off Rav Kook, but I don't really know. Like that, and suggestions for other speakers. And Emir should be an Ilon Nishama, as I said, for my uncle, for Refoel ben Mordechai.
Thank you so much. Thank you very